Welcome to Sharkie's Gaming Controllers. I'm Sharkie, and in today's video I'll be taking a look at the GrizTech Grizpaw controller. Now this controller is a one-handed controller designed for multiple systems, including PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, original Xbox, and PC. Now this controller is not made by some huge company. It's made by a guy that used to sell these on the GrizTech website back in 2011, so you could call this a custom controller. It was very limited, and I doubt many were made. I don't think there was a huge interest in this thing back at the time, so it's probably quite rare now. Now this controller does come in a box, but it's just a standard white box. There are no images or text, as you can see. It's just really plain and simple. So with the box out of the way, let's go straight into the features of this controller. The Grizpaw controller looks very interesting on first glance. It has a very unique shape. I mean, just look at it, it's got round at the top here, it sort of tapers down to sort of a curved square down the bottom here. It's a very unique looking shape. Now the main body is made out of this kind of brown glossy plastic. It's very smooth to touch and very reflective. This controller is also very thin. You can see how thin it is there. It's sort of thinner at the bottom than the top. There's the other side. On the bottom here, you've got the GrizTech name there, printed on the body in black. There's the top, and you can sort of see how thicker the top is there. And flipping it over onto the back here, you'll see that there are 4 raised feet here, and these feet have little rubber pads on them so they don't slip on the surface that you're using it on. This is also signed by the creator, so you can see the signature down here, signed by the creator, as well as the date this controller was produced, which was 2011. Now this controller has a pretty decent length of cable there. Should be enough to run it from where you're sitting to your console or your PC, depending which system you're using. Now on the end here, you've got 3 different connectors. So you've got USB for PS3 and PC. You've got the PS2 connector, and you've got the original Xbox connector as well. So plenty of systems you can use this on. Now on the front of the Grizpaw here, you can see right on the bottom there is a slightly raised rubberized palm rest. You can see the side view that it is raised quite a bit off the controller body. It's got the Grizpaw name and a cool kind of a bear claw logo there in the center. It looks quite nice. It stands out quite nicely on the grey. Up the top here, you have 14 silver colored buttons on top. All these buttons have these small little round indents in the very center of the button. And this is to let you know where you need to press the button. So you need to press it right in the center where that little divot is. Otherwise it won't trigger. So if you go too close to the edge like this, or on the top there or something, most likely it won't trigger. You have to press it dead center in that little divot. Now as a side note with my controller here, I've got 2 buttons at the top here, this one and this one, that are actually depressed down. You can see they don't spring it back up, those 2, when I press them, where the rest do. And this is not from use. It's actually been in storage for years unused, so whatever mechanism they used in these buttons has just worn out. So it can't be a very high quality mechanism. Now the rest of the buttons here do spring up though, and they do have a decent sound as well. Luckily these 2 buttons that don't spring up, they still work if you press them, they just don't spring back up. Now moving down, you've got another large button in the center here. This one's a large black button. It's a little bit harder, and it's got a very different sound and click to the rest of the buttons. And then finally, you've got 2 analog sticks. Yes, these 2 round things down here that look like buttons are actually analog sticks. You can see how flat they are. They're pressed right against the body of the controller, but they actually move like analog sticks. So So they basically slide around when you move them. So unlike a traditional analog stick that has a lot more movement, these ones you just kind of slide and move around like you would be using an analog stick. They sort of feel like small analog sticks, but are very different from a gamepad. There's less overall movement. Instead, the stick feels like you're using a slide switch, except you're operating it as you would do an analog stick by moving it all around in all directions and quite constantly. So it has a very different feeling to it. It does have a bit of resistance, but it does feel smooth to move. There's not much grip though. As you can see, these little caps here are made of shiny plastic, so they're very smooth to the touch. And another thing, the caps rotate. So this combination means that your fingers can easily slide off this. There's just very little grip. It's a very strange choice. Usually there's some kind of rubberized grip on top of the sticks so that you can actually have some purchase when you're playing. But yeah, and also the fact that the caps move, like sometimes your finger, if you do too close to the edge, your finger is just going to slide right off. So the combination of moving caps as well as the smooth plastic is a very strange choice. Why wouldn't you put something so that your fingers wouldn't slide off as easily? So how is the Grizpaw controller used? Well, the idea is that this is a one-handed controller. What do you need a one-handed controller for? Well, the essential idea is that you want a one-handed controller to play your games one-handed. So perhaps you just want to play one-handed while you have a drink or eat something with the other hand, or perhaps you're disabled and missing an arm or missing a hand. Then this controller will enable you to play games one-handed. And of course, you can either use your left hand or your right hand. Either is fine with the controller, so it is quite flexible in that regard. So essentially, you take the controller, you align your palm to the rest there. Your thumb will operate one stick while your pinky finger operates the other, and the free three fingers in the center will operate the buttons. Now in theory this should work quite well, but there are some major design flaws to this controller. First, the controller itself is probably too large and the buttons also too big. This combination means you have to stretch to reach everything. Like if your fingers on the stick here and you're trying to stretch to reach these top buttons, you're really stretching and your fingers are slipping off the sticks while you're doing that. So not only are you stretching, but you're constantly slipping off the sticks while you're doing it. So the buttons are far too big because they just make you have to reach too far at the edge of the controller. And like I said before, that these caps are very shiny, so when you're trying to keep your fingers, your pinky and your thumb on these sticks, you are going to slip off as you start stretching. They'll just slip off constantly. The other thing is it's very uncomfortable for your hand. So I mean, just look at the position of my hand right now. Pinky is sort of really bent, and if you're trying to stretch the top, you're sort of bending it even more. So it's just really uncomfortable. Now, while your thumb still has quite a decent control over the stick, because your thumbs are used to using analog sticks, your pinky though, that's going to be so much more harder. It's not only going to slide off and move that cap rotating, but it's also just going to be harder to move the actual analog stick. The resistance is there, and there's not a huge amount of resistance, it's enough, but because you're using your pinky finger, which is not a finger you normally use an analog stick with, you'll really feel that resistance, especially when you're in this bent position. So it'll be very uncomfortable for your hand, and especially that pinky finger. Now you could technically use the other finger, but then you've got less fingers to use the buttons, and then you can't stretch as far either. So neither of them are perfect, it's just uncomfortable all around. And you know, after a little bit your fingers will start to hurt in that position. While it's definitely possible to use it like this, it's not ideal in the slightest, and those moving caps are really annoying. Like you put your pinky on the edge here, and then suddenly it rotates and you slide off. Same with your thumb, but at least your thumb, if you put in the center, you have a little bit more control to stop that happening. With your pinky, if you're not paying attention essentially, you will put in the wrong position and you'll slide right off. So it's definitely a major design flaw, just how it's laid out in general. Another flaw is that you have to memorize the buttons. As you can see on the buttons here, there are no actual symbols or anything. The only buttons that have symbols are these arrows. And these are actually the D-pad. So up, down, left, and right. So it's a very weird placement for the D-pad first off. But then how do you know what buttons are what? Well, this controller comes with a little guide. So it's just a printed guide on a piece of paper, and it just shows you which numbers are the buttons and of course what they translate to on each system. So you can sort of go through whatever platform you're using this on and start using it. But again, you've got to remember which are which, and wait till you see the layout of this controller. I don't know, it just does not make sense. So we'll start with just PS2 because that's probably quite recognizable, and we'll go through this list. So you've got your main face buttons. You've got triangle, circle, X, and square. So those are buttons 1, 2, 3, and 4. So your triangle button is this very top button here, right? And if you look here, number 2 is the next one down. So that would be circle. So triangle, circle. Then of course you've got 3 and 4 are these 2 edge buttons here. So this basically is X and square. So your main face buttons are right in the center here. Then you go to L1 and R1, which are 5 and 6. Now you would think they'd be closer, but if you look here, number 5 and number 6 are these very edge buttons. Then you go down, you've got your L2 and R2, which are number 7 and 8. And if you look here, number 7 and 8 are these middle ones here. Then you've got select and start, which are your 2 silver buttons in the center here. Then of course you've got the D-pad buttons, which I mentioned before, which are your arrow buttons here. So up, down, left, and right. And then finally you've got your analog sticks and your mode button, which is this large black button in the center. And that also is the PS button on the PlayStation, so like the PlayStation button. So it's a very confusing layout, and you have to sort of memorize this when you're playing. And remember, you're using this one-handed. So if you wanted to basically play this normally, you'd be using the analog sticks like this, your left and your right analog. To get face buttons, you'd be pressing this one, this one, this one, and this one. Those are your face buttons, which it's so hard to kind of press those regularly while still keeping your pinky on that stick. And then if you want to use your bumpers, you've got to reach out to here. If you want to use your triggers, you've got to press these. And of course, if you want to use select or start, you use these center ones. So it's just a job to stretch out. And of course, on top of that, if you want to use your D-pad, you've got to remember that that's up, down, left, and right. There are arrows there, but it takes your mind a little bit to kind of grasp, because you're used to a D-pad being in a solid block and not so spread out all over the place. And of course then not forgetting which button is which. Like, oh, what were the triggers again? Oh yeah, they were these ones. What are the face buttons again? Oh yeah, which face button is which? Oh, that's triangle, okay. You know, you've got to actually remember which is which. And the way they've spread it out it's just really strange. It's not ergonomic at all. It looks like basically they designed this controller and they think, oh, we got to fit all these buttons. What do we do? And they just kind of shoved them anywhere that they thought might be good. Might be because they had a favorite game and they kind of laid it out like they thought it should have done. I don't know, but it's a very strange choice. And like I said, because this controller is not that comfortable, when you're trying to use it, on top of that, trying to figure out which button is which is quite hard. And then to have your thumb or even your pinky slip off the analog stick is more irritating. And on top of that, just using this, it's just really uncomfortable. Now you can get away with using this. It does work. All the buttons work. The sticks work. But, you know, like, don't you want something a little bit more comfortable that you don't have to stretch? And basically, your hand is like that when you're using it. So you're kind of bending your pinky finger and your thumb. And again, you're moving those while they're in that bent position. And then you're stretching to try and press the buttons. It's not ergonomic at all. This controller is just really, its design is sound, like they had a good idea to make a one-handed controller, but just the way they implemented it, there's so many design flaws in this. It's not ergonomic at all. You can't even come close to say this is an ergonomic controller. And I just don't know what they were thinking with the layout. It's just a really strange layout, and they definitely made these buttons far too big. If these buttons were a bit more smaller and spread out in a logical manner, it'd probably be a lot better. Just something that's easier to kind of grab. And also the fact that these analog sticks are flat, actually, like, it's a cool kind of concept the way they've done that, but it actually works against the controller. They've done it to make it easier so that you can use the buttons while using analog sticks in this kind of lowered position. But having the sticks that are easy to slide off of and so low actually make it harder to move with fingers like the pinky finger that you're not used to moving sticks with. So I don't know, it kind of works in the opposite direction. It's sort of, they designed it to make it easier, but I think it just made it harder. And standard analog sticks might have been too high on this kind of low profile controller, because then you'd be up here somewhere, but they should have thought of something slightly different, I think. It's a cool idea, but yeah, just really strangely executed, and this controller definitely has some major design flaws. Overall, the Grizpaw controller is a cool looking and unique controller, but it's definitely not a good one-handed controller. It's just too large, uncomfortable, and unergonomic for it to be of any real use. You could definitely use this thing if you're really desperate for a one-handed controller, but there are several controllers out there that are far better. If you want a good one-handed controller that looks similar to this, then look up the Ben Heck Access controller, the Dragon Plus RPG Duocon 2, or the Hori Super Robo Wars controllers. I have all these on my channel. I'll leave links in the description if you want to check them out. All these are better designed and far more comfortable to use than the Grizpaw. The sticks are larger and the buttons smaller and more centrally positioned. They take a bit of time to get used to, but they are far better than this Grizpaw. Even if you're used to the Grizpaw for hours, I don't think it would get easier. In fact, it's probably a challenge to continually use this thing for more than 10 minutes without wanting to lift out your hand and stretch out your fingers. If you want an idea, just hold your hand like that, in that position, for a few minutes, and you'll start to feel it, especially in your pinky here. And if you imagine moving that around with a bit of resistance on the sticks and also having to stretch your fingers, it's just that uncomfortable that I don't think you'll want to use this thing. Now, even though I wouldn't recommend the Grizpaw for use, it's still a rare controller. It's unique in its own right, and this thing could still make a great collectible. But definitely don't use it. It's not worth being uncomfortable. Leave it in storage where it belongs. Anyway guys, that was the GrizTech Grizpaw controller. If you liked this video, then go ahead and hit that like button, as it really helps out a lot. Don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications so you don't miss any of my new videos, as I'll have heaps more gaming controls and accessories up very shortly. If you'd like to support my channel, then click the join button below and become a channel member. You'll get monthly perks, and the extra support really helps me out a lot. Thanks again for watching guys, I'll see you in the next one.